Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. I interview incredible people who've dedicated their lives to helping those who've been impacted by trauma. Here we go.
Hey, Rick, nice to see you.
Oh, great to be here.
Thank you so much. So we're going to just get into it and start with the basics, which is what is MDMA? And from your perspective, why is it such a powerful healing tool?
Well, let me start by saying that MDMA is not a plant medicine, which MDMA is a synthetic chemical. As far as we know, it does not appear in nature. It was invented by Merck in 1912, the pharmaceutical company. They found nothing interesting in it in all of their animal studies, so they never did anything in humans. MDMA is more widely known as ecstasy, and it was a therapy drug from the middle 70s to the early 80s before it became the party drug ecstasy, and that's what ended up causing it to be criminalized in 1985. But what it does is it helps people to approach difficult conversations, difficult emotional traumatic memories in a less fear-based manner. It has oxytocin, which is the hormone of love and connection that it releases, so people feel more empathic, both to others and to themselves. It has a lot to do with self-compassion, and it has properties that can be very useful in a therapeutic context when people are facing frightening memories that are overwhelming. It sort of calms the fear centers of the brain, the amygdala, so that people can experience and express what's happened in the past that has previously felt overwhelming.
Okay, great. And so for those who, even myself, right, we hear sassafras, it being the derivative of sassafras. It doesn't have to do with that, correct? When people think of it.
Well, you can get from sassafras, you get saffrol oil, and then you modify it a bunch of times, and then you can get MDMA. So people have a romantic attachment to plant medicines. So, it's good marketing to call it sassafras, but it's not in sassafras.
Fair enough. Thank you for clarifying that, because I know some people say that. They're like, it's technically a plant medicine. I'm like, no, not exactly. Not exactly. So
Not
in
really.
terms of your, the research you've been a part of and what you've seen in long-term healing, especially with like treatment-resistant PTSD, I mean, what can you tell us about what has come out of the clinical trials and everything?
Well, MAPS has been doing research, MAPS meaning, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, our nonprofit, which I started in '86, and also our sort of public benefit pharma company that is now not ours, but most owned by investors. We began work with PTSD in 2000. So there's been basically 25 years of research with MDMA-assisted therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. And I want to make the first point that it's really therapy more than the drug, that loads and loads of people, 20 million Americans have taken MDMA or ecstasy. And a lot of them had PTSD and still have PTSD or had some other issues. So what we really think about as the operating principle is the therapeutic relationship, the safe, supportive, trusting relationship called a therapeutic alliance that can be built between a patient and a therapist. And then within that, the MDMA makes it easier for these traumas to surface and then to be processed.
That's incredible. And what have the results been from what you guys have researched?
Yeah, so there's basically from 2000 to 2016, we did what are called phase 2 studies. And that's where you look at what the doses are used, what's your patient population, what are your outcome measures, what's your therapeutic intervention. And so from that, what we learned is that the healing potential of MDMA-assisted therapy is independent of the cause of the trauma. So if somebody had sexual abuse or violent attack or war-related or fires from PTSD from the fires in LA or other things, that once you have PTSD, it's sort of this repetitive fear-based emotions that never really go away. The emotions, that the experiences are never really processed. So once you start the phase 3 studies, what we found is that we compared therapy with no MDMA versus therapy with MDMA. And so we have 3 8-hour sessions, 1 month apart, and then 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, 3 for preparation before the first MDMA session, and then 3 for integration after each MDMA or therapy without any MDMA session. So it's the same 42 hours of therapy, whether you get therapy with no MDMA or therapy with MDMA. So the first study was severe PTSD. And what we showed is that 32% of the people that got therapy without any MDMA at all no longer had PTSD at the 2-month follow-up, which is really pretty good. We had a very low dropout rate. However, when you add MDMA, it more than doubles to 67%. So that's pretty remarkable. And another 21% had what's called clinically significant reductions of PTSD symptoms, meaning that they still have PTSD, but their symptoms have declined enough that it's a noticeable difference in their lives. So those are called responders. So we had 88% responders and 12% where it just didn't work. Then the second study was we expanded it to moderate to severe PTSD. But 3/4 of them had severe PTSD, around 1/4 had moderate PTSD. And keep in mind now, these are the therapists. We had sites in Israel, Canada, and the US. They've had practice. Now they're working in this context. They're getting better and better. So in the second study, 47% no longer had PTSD from the therapy without any MDMA at all, which is better than any other therapy for PTSD with very, very low dropout rate also. So studies that were done by the Veterans Administration took around 6 years, 914 veterans comparing cognitive processing therapy versus prolonged exposure. About 50% of the people dropped out of the study because the therapy was re-traumatizing. They had to go over their therapy, their trauma over and over and over, but it just didn't have the reductions of fear, that sense of self-acceptance that comes from the MDMA. So we had very low dropout rate and incredible 47.6% no longer had PTSD. But when you add MDMA, now it's about 72% no longer had PTSD, and another 15% had clinically significant reductions of PTSD. So according to Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score, which many people have probably heard about trauma and all the different treatments, he's published a paper recently that's saying that he thinks this is the most effective approach to treating PTSD, is therapy combined with MDMA.
Wow, that is so incredible to see those numbers laid out. And, my other question was like, so many therapists hit a wall in traditional talk therapy especially when it comes to complex trauma. And so, like, how do you see therapists, like, what role do you see therapists playing in this new frontier with this?
Well, again, it's not the drug, it's the therapists. It's the therapeutic relationship. So therapists are going to be key to going forward. According to the Veterans Administration, not just among veterans, but there's 13 million PTSD patients in America alone. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of PTSD patients all over the world. And so therapists are going to be key. However, when we talk about, for example, Rwanda or South Africa or Ukraine, for example, war zones, things that there's enormous amount of trauma, there's not very many psychiatrists and therapists in these places. So I think we're going to be expanding to looking at nurses, to looking at other kinds of healers in other places. But it's always going to be the case that the context that is created by therapists or nurses or even friends, peer support, we do a lot of work on peer support, that they're going to be absolutely essential, because it's not, it's fundamentally different than the drugs you get from your psychiatrists, which are meant to control the symptoms. and you just take them on your own at home on a daily basis. This is, you take them only a few times, the MDMA only a few times, with the therapist there the whole time during an 8-hour therapy session, and you go to the root causes and try to reprocess. And then there's a whole other new area of neuroscience called neuroplasticity. So what it means is that psychedelics can open up what are called critical periods, where you can format your brain in a way. You process information in a different way. And that's where the integration part comes in, where you sort of reinforce what happened during this session with the MDMA, and then you can reinforce it. So I think as we want to really scale this to address, the enormous trauma that exists in our world, there's also what's called epigenetic trauma. So what that means is multi-generational trauma. There's been research that shows that trauma can be passed down through the generations. So it's more like a set point for anxiety or depression or things or fear. And there's research that Rachel Yehuda's done at the Bronx VA with people who have received MDMA-assisted therapy, and she's looked at the epigenetics before and after therapy. And there's preliminary suggestions that a successful therapy, and it doesn't necessarily need to be through MDMA, but successful therapy can change these epigenetic mechanisms so that we don't need to keep passing this trauma down the generational line.
That is amazing. And, they say it's 7 to 14 generations back, 7 to 14 generations forward. So we can really shift the way our genes are expressed, right, from day to day and disease. And really, people don't realize that it's only 10 to 20% the role that our DNA plays in disease. So epigenetics are huge in healing so much. So that's fantastic. And sometimes when I'm, speaking with a client who's interested in sitting with, MDMA or any psychedelic, but we're discussing MDA specifically, they worry about perhaps losing control or being re-traumatized. How is this addressed in preparation?
Well, the first part about being re-traumatized, that's what I talked about in terms of the research that was done with prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. If you're being asked to just go over and over and over the trauma without, even if you have a good therapeutic relationship, that can be re-traumatizing because it's been overwhelming before. So the thing that addresses the re-traumatization part is this 8-hour session, because we are not asking people to go to their trauma. We're saying to people, whatever you're concerned about, whatever happens, whatever emerges, you can deal with it in whatever time frame you want. So we support what's emerging. We're not trying to move people to the trauma. So I think when people have to engage with the trauma too quickly, that can be re-traumatizing. The other part that makes it so that it's not so re-traumatizing is the MDMA itself, is that it reduces this fear response so that these emotions and these memories can be processed. And actually, people remember more of the trauma when they're under the influence of MDMA, because parts of it they've put out of their mind. And so we have many, many stories of people that are under MDMA therapy, and they've said, oh, I'm here because I was in a war, and this is my trauma. And then you work through that, and then they start talking about how when they were children, they had an abusive father and were beaten up. And so a lot of times people have put certain traumas out of their mind, and so the MDMA can really help them process it in a way so that it's not re-traumatizing. The first part of your question, though, was not about re-traumatizing. It was about
what was I saying? The role of what therapists will play in this.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was after that. I'm sorry. It was
preparation. How is this addressed in preparation? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So the key parts of the preparation, and usually in the experiment, at least, we would have 3 90-minute sessions roughly once a week. So the preparation is to help people understand what MDMA does, to help them understand that there's a basis of sort of basic information about what their trauma was, what the issues might come up, but it's more really about getting a feel for whether the therapists and the patients are a good mix. So occasionally in this preparation phase, for whatever reasons, either the patient or the therapist will feel like they're not a good match, and then they will find other therapists. But the preparation is really very important about helping people to feel that they are safe and supported. Oh, also losing control. That was what you claimed. Okay, so
Oh, yeah.
that was the key part. So the preparation is to point out that often the control is the problem, because when you keep things in control, but the fear is that you get re-traumatized. So it's to say that what we like to say is that difficult is not the same as bad. What's the difference between a difficult experience and a bad experience? It's usually resistance or control. It's keeping it in control. So both the drug and the therapeutic alliance are there to try to help people feel that there is this idea of losing control, but that you're not out of control, but you're not suppressing feelings that you think are overwhelming. Now you're able to process them. So it's like you've built your capacity to have difficult emotions flow through you. And so that's what the preparation is for. So that the fear is that this is a safe place to quote, lose control.
So by the time they actually sit with the medicine, they feel resourced, they feel like they're in a safe enough container where if they quote unquote lose control, they're with safe people to experience that. And generally speaking, it's two therapists, right?
Yeah, we often use male, female. It's not always that way. But yeah, there's two therapists. Because a lot of times people who have PTSD have had childhood trauma, and to have like a well-functioning male-female team can be really helpful. Again, we've sometimes had two women, two men, people who don't identify with either gender in that way. But we want it so that if one of the therapists goes to the bathroom and somebody had this abandonment and then they open their eyes and there's nobody there, that's not so good. So we always want somebody to be there.
And for someone who hasn't sat with this medicine before, 8 hours probably seems like such a long time. For those of us who have, it feels like it goes by like that. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah. Well, what we do is an initial dose. We use the first MDMA session is 80 milligrams. The second and third people can go up to 120 milligrams. But after 2 hours, we add half the initial amount. And that is precisely to make it longer, to make the experience go longer. So again, this 8 hours is really protective. So if somebody feels like they're approaching something and they feel like they're losing control, if you have an hour therapy session once a week and you're thinking, oh, I got to make use of all this time. But when you have an 8-hour session, you can approach something and you say, I'm not ready to deal with that. Or I want to hold off for a bit. You can do that. And then you come back around it at a later time. So it has that kind of built-in safeguard. And what people feel is it's like grief. When people are really, someone that they love has died or something, when you try to hold the grief in, it persists. But when you can cry and let it out, you're processing the grief, and then it moves from foreground to background. So I think that's the way to say it. Now, actually, I'll just tell one super fast story about one of the—
Go ahead, take your time.
This was his first of 3 MDMA sessions. And what he realized was, under the influence of MDMA, he came up with this insight that the PTSD had something good about it. It was the way that he showed loyalty to the friends that had died. That as long as he was suffering, he had them in their mind. He had them in his mind, And then what he was able to do under the MDMA is see himself from the eyes of his dead friends. And he saw them saying to him, we cannot live. We don't want you to honor us by being traumatized and not able to do anything. You can honor us by living. That would be better. And then
Mm.
he said, okay, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And in that moment, he cured himself of PTSD because he found a different way to honor his dead friends. They could live through him rather than him suffering in that
Mm.
way to show that he was connected to them. And then he said, I'm on opiates for pain, but I don't really think I'm taking them for pain. I don't need the opiates anymore. And then he said, you know what? I don't even need the MDMA anymore. I'm done. I want to drop out of the study. And the researcher said, you can drop out anytime you want, but would you do the 2 month and 1 year follow-up? Which he did. And he did not have PTSD at the 2 month. He didn't have it at the 1 year. And that was about 15 years ago. And he's still fine.
Oh, that's an incredible story. And, I've said this before, which is that grief, feeling your grief won't kill you, not feeling it might, because it festers.
Yes, that's exactly the point. That's exactly it.
It festers and it affects our autonomic nervous system and our immune system function and our hormones and so much more. And there's also, I've noticed this pattern sometimes where, someone in our life has passed away and we have a lot of trauma around it. And it's almost as though us suffering with that trauma is how we stay connected to them.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yes.
like in this case, and when in fact it's the other way around. It's living in our joy. It's following our joy. It's being in our joy and our healing. So yes, thank you for that amazing story.
Yeah.
That tells you so much. And I like what you said. He healed himself, like he healed his own PTSD. The medicine just kind of, I say the medicine just kind of guides us to healing ourselves. It doesn't do it for us. Of course, it sets things up in a really great, powerful way, especially with neuroplasticity and all of that, but we do the work.
Well, and that's also true for the therapists. So the essence of our method is that we are trying to help people to heal themselves. The
Mm,
therapists are there to provide a safe space. The MDMA is there to help them process.
mhm,
But people have to do the hard work. And then once you've learned that you can process difficult things, then you can do that on your own without the drug. So that's where it's again different than classic pharmaceutical drugs where you take them every day for years. Sometimes we have an intervention that's several times. And the
mm,
goal is to teach people enough skills and to feel self-efficacy that they can process and heal themselves, that then when they got out into their life, when new traumas happen, they won't be overwhelming. They'll
mm.
process them.
I love how empowering it is. And ultimately, whoever's listening to this, you are the medicine. Sometimes we just need that reminder. And here's MDMA and here's therapy, and both combined can totally be that reminder for you.
Yeah.
So, for those listening, right, accessibility is huge. Like, how can I get this? How soon can I start this type of therapy and work with this? I mean, what can you tell folks who are listening who, don't know much about MDMA and where it is legally at this point?
Well, it's unclear exactly what the FDA wants to see in terms of additional information before they make it available as a prescription medicine.
Okay.
So it could be 6 months, it could be 3 years. It's not really clear. But I do feel that it's important to say that the drug war itself is counterproductive. And I think it's a fundamental violation of people's human rights to explore their consciousness. So, you put in the word legal. And so, unfortunately, there is no place in the world where MDMA is legal outside of a research context. So you can go to Oregon for psilocybin. You can soon go to Colorado for psilocybin. You can go to Jamaica. You can go to Costa Rica for psilocybin. You can go to South America for ayahuasca. There's no place that people can go for a legal MDMA experience unless it's in a clinical trial. And so I think that that's really sad. And what MAPS is about is sort of these two parallel paths. One is drug development to make MDMA into medicine through the FDA and then have insurance coverage to cover the cost of the drug and the therapy. But then the other is to legalize drug policy reform so people could do it on their own or with friends or, without all of this. So I think right now people have to really decide for themselves, um, is the legal status critical to you? If so, you're going to have to wait for a bunch of years or 6 months, or we don't know exactly how long, but it's going to be a wait unless you're in a research project. But if you can think about the laws as some are good laws, some are bad laws, the drug war is a bad law, it's counterproductive. Then the question is finding good MDMA.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there are test kits. You can go to Dance Safe, things like that to find that out.
Yeah, harm reduction model, definitely ensure that if you are going to take anything, that it isn't mixed with something you wouldn't want in your body.
Yeah.
And
Now, also, sorry to interrupt, but there's the treatment manual, which is what describes our therapeutic approach. So it's up for free on the MAPS website. It's called the treatment manual. And that gives you a sense of, these are sort of the instructions to the therapists of how to work with someone through the study. And that would be helpful for people to read.
Thank you for that. That is amazing, you guys. I mean, you guys are amazing in general, but that you have that out for public knowledge and use. I appreciate that. And speaking of therapists, well, let me go back. So for someone who wants to be a part of a clinical trial, how do they do that? How do they go about that?
Well, that part, it's easy to figure out. So clinicaltrials.gov,
Mm-hmm.
clinicaltrials.gov. So it used to be that pharmaceutical companies have to have 2 phase 3 studies that are prove safety and efficacy, but you just need 2 of them. And a lot of them, companies used to do 5 or 6 studies, and you'd never hear about the ones that failed. They'd never publish them, but you'd only hear about the ones that succeeded. And that's all that they would submit to the FDA. As a response, because people felt they weren't getting the right information, clinicaltrials.gov was set up so that when you're doing an FDA approved trial, it has to be listed on clinicaltrials.gov. So if you go there, you can put in your MDMA or LSD or psilocybin or depression or PTSD, and it will search and you will find all the clinical trials that are being conducted with that condition or with those drugs or that condition with this drug in this state, so that you can use clinicaltrials.gov as a major resource.
Great. And for therapists, psychologists who want to learn more about psychedelic assisted therapy, MAPS does, right, offer trainings. How can they get involved in that if they're interested in being properly trained?
Yeah, well, we've got, you can go to the MAPS website. I'm leaving in a couple weeks for Ukraine. We're training Ukrainian therapists. We've got trainings all over we've had trainings in Sarajevo, in Iceland, in Australia, in Israel. We're planning one in Poland, in Switzerland. So you can go to the MAPS website and look at training, but there's not that many opportunities. We haven't had trainings in the United States for a while. One of the best things they could do is to consider coming to Psychedelic Science 2025. So this is June 16th to the 20th in Denver. And we're going to have workshops from our leading therapists. So you can get a short version of the training. The basic training is 6 days, and it's for 50 or 55 people at a time. And it goes over the treatment manual, what we call adherence criteria, core competencies, watch videotapes of therapy sessions, do role play, a lot of different exercises and discussions. Then the second part is optional, will always be optional, but it's for therapists to take the medicine themselves in a therapeutic setting as if they're the patient. And that's one of the best ways to learn. It's like you would never go to an ayahuasca shaman that had never done ayahuasca.
I hope not.
Yeah, I hope not. So we have had FDA approved protocols. That's, again, only in a protocol, and it will never be required, only encouraged, strongly recommended, but never required. And then the third part is once people work with their first PTSD patients, ideally it gets, at least in our research, it's all videotaped, and then we have supervisors review the videotapes and give the feedback to the therapist to help them really fine tune the treatment manual. And then they're free to practice however they want, to add different things like that. So I think the treatment I will recommend a video called Trip of Compassion.
Trip of
And
compassion.
Trip of Compassion, it's on Vimeo. It's the most patient-centered video ever made about MDMA-assisted therapy. So it's about 3 of the Israeli patients. It's mostly in English. The parts of it in Hebrew have English subtitles. And it's going to be a really good education in how the therapy actually works.
Okay, great. I didn't even know that existed, so I appreciate
Oh,
that.
great. Yeah, it's really good.
For, for when this